Good afternoon, panelists and audience. Welcome to the second session of the first day, Recognizing Differences. I will take this opportunity to welcome the moderator and the panelists of this session. The moderator for the session is Ms. Preetha Venkatachalam, who is a partner with the Britspan Group. She heads the market impact in South Asia at Britspan. Before she joined Britspan, she also established a network of India. Preetha has been Preeta has been a research scholar at the Development Studies Institute at the London School of Economics. She has done intensive research on tribal communities in India. Ms. Preeta holds an MBA from IIM Bangalore. Just a quick check with the audience. Are you able to hear me? Great, thanks. I welcome all the panelists, Dr. Nirmala Nair, Dr. Thelma Narayan, Ms. Preeti Patkar, and Ms. Shanti Raghavan. All our panelists have many accolades to their credit. Dr. Nair is the founder and or co-founder of Ekjut, a voluntary organization. Ekjut's work in the grassroots and evidence-based collaborative research has shown immense improvements in the maternal, newborn and child health and nutrition indicators in rural India for close to 2 decades. She not only works at remote location of Chakradarpur in West Singhbhum district of Jharkhand, but it's heartening to know that she lives there with the community as well. Our second panelist, Ms. Preeti Patkar, who is a co-founder and executive secretary of Prerna, an NGO working to end intergenerational traffic and protect rights of children. In 2009, Prerna was also awarded for its work on child protection by the Star Foundation, United Kingdom. She created first of the kind shelter for children living in the brothel area for Night Care Center. So over the past 33 years, over 15,000 children have benefited from this comprehensive support. Preeti was appointed on the Central Advisory Committee to combat trafficking of women and children for commercial sexual exploitation. Preeti is a graduate from the School of Social Work at Nirmala Niketan College of Social Work. Thank you, Preeti and Dr. Nair, for joining us. Now, I would like to introduce Ms. Shanti Raghavan, founder Enable India, which was established in 2014. Her work with the persons with disability has led to coining of a new word called includability. And we look forward to hear more about this during the session. Enable India has impacted 220,000 stakeholders across 28 states in India till date. She has been recognized by many national and international forums for her work related to disabled people. Business in today has identified as one of the most powerful women in business in 2017. Um, I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Thelma Narayan. Apologies. Yes. She is the director of Suchara School of Public Health Equity and Action. Dr. Narayan is an epidemiologist, health policy analyst, and scholar activist who was the director of Suchara School of Public Health Equity and Action. She is a member of the advisory group on community action for health of the National Health Mission. She has a degree in medicine from St. John's Medical College, Bangalore, a master degree in epidemiology and a doctorate in public health policy from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Over to you, Preeta. Thanks all the panelists and moderators. Look forward to a great session. Bye.
Thank you, Sadeshna. And it's great to be back on this Chacha panel. I still recall exactly a year ago when Chacha was introduced to the world. And I think it's a great forum to discuss issues of importance to the social sector, and particularly issues about recognizing differences, because this is a topic that's often ignored and marginalized, like the populations that we're going to talk about. My favorite story, who some of the people I've worked with have heard from me, is really about the groundwater issue and the story of the fish, which I'd like to quickly narrate before going on to the panel. This is by the Racial Equity Institute, and it was originally developed to profound stories about racism, structural differences, but are equally applicable for multiple differences and divides we see across society. So the story goes like this. Imagine you're walking out of your house and you see in a nearby lake one of the fish floating in the water dead, belly up. What do you all think when you see that fish? Maybe you think that something's wrong with that fish, it ate something bad, or while it was swimming something was poisonous and it died belly up. So if you liken it to a health system, maybe that patient didn't go fast enough to the health center for their care, or perhaps they didn't have good nutrition because of their situation at home and that person died. So you situated in that fish or that individual in the health system. And then you walk around that same lake around your house and you realize that it's not just one fish, but actually tens and hundreds of fish that are dead and all belly up again. And then you wonder, right? Like, is it really a fish issue or is it a lake issue? Again, is it an individual patient issue or is the health system at some level failing all patients or multiple patients? And then you continue walking, a little disturbed, but you further walk down from your house and you see about 5 or 6 lake systems near your house, all of them having the tens or hundreds of fish dead and belly up. So not just one fish or one lake, but 5 or 6 lakes with similar symptoms of multiple fish dying. And then what do you think? It's clearly not the fish. Perhaps it's not just the health system. Maybe it's the groundwater itself that's affecting, this whole issue. And it's fascinating, but as you read into this literature more, you'll realize that 95% of the fresh water in the planet Earth that we live in is actually just beneath the surface, not visible on the ground. And I think that's a great parallel to the issue of vulnerable populations, marginalized populations, persons with differences, because you will notice that these are structural barriers. Of course, in today's session, our eminent panelists are going to talk about health, but equally, you'll find that these are the same families, same communities, same populations that are at the raw end of not just poor health, but potentially poor education, lack of justice, greater criminalization, discrimination in nutrition, day-to-day socioeconomic affairs, political legal systems, etc., etc. And for us talking from privileged positions of power, it's much easier. But going to live the lives of these populations, I think one would realize that it's really important for us to recognize these differences, not just from a systemic issue, but from a groundwater issue, and also solve for it, hence, from a groundwater issue. So, with that kind of preliminary story that really, I hope, highlights the depth of this issue to every one of us, I do want to point out that there are multiple differences, right? So, it's not just one particular form of disability or marginalization that's more or less important. So, the differences could be along lines of gender. We heard some questions about LGBTQ community in the earlier session with Dr. Srinath Reddy. There are differences in terms of persons with multiple or different disabilities. There are elderly, vulnerable women and children, differences on account of caste. As Sudeshna mentioned, we've been working very closely with Piramal Swasthya on setting up a tribal health collaborative. So, been deeply understanding tribal health issues across the country. And each of these differences highlight needs that are unique and need to be addressed in a very unique and community manner. So I think in today's panel we have experts who are working on several of these differences, but perhaps not all. But let's go deep in some of these areas to understand what are the fundamental issues, and then the second half of today's session move on to looking at potential solutions to make the healthcare system more inclusive, more empowering, and more recognizing of all the communities that it's set up to serve. So, with that introduction, I think our first question that the panelists are going to talk about is about what are some of the root causes that each of you see in terms of the barriers to access healthcare. And that could be due to stigma, discrimination, other fundamental barriers. And I'd love to hear from each of you about, what's been your experience on some of these barriers. To begin with, perhaps, Nirmala, would you like to go first? And
Yeah,
if you
thank
please,
you, Preeta.
3 minutes.
Uh, I think you've made my work quite easy. So I think To understand my perspective better, I'll have to share some of the context first. Something about Ekjut, how we understood the word marginalization right from the beginning. When Ekjut was being conceived and the vision statement and the values were being written down, the terms equity, justice, and empowerment, like you've just mentioned, they were high up on our list. Ekjut has been partnering with some of the most marginalized rural communities, tribal, especially tribal communities, in several districts of the country. And it is shown that there is a possibility of addressing many pressing and intractable problems by leveraging on the agency of women, and that also through structured community capacity building approaches that I'll be talking about the process a little later. I'll just take you back 2003 when we relocated ourselves from Delhi to Jharkhand, where we belong. And before we actually got grounded in the village, I had started my clinic in a small township called Chakradarpur. And this clinic largely caters to the relatively better off communities. But back in my village where we had built a house, I was seeing a totally different section of people when patients came from the nearby villages for treatment. And that was actually a great learning for us, because we were able to understand about the direct causes and also about the underlying causes or the causes of causes, the social determinants, the issues of discrimination that were responsible for their condition. For example, when the assistant in my clinic used to come late to my clinic because she was not allowed to collect water from a common tube well before all the others had first finished, because of caste-based discrimination, or when some of them complained of being ill-treated at the health centers for various reasons, or the multiple reasons for their preference for informal providers who were readily available at their doorsteps, and with their crookery and the quackery, of course. Gradually, my visits to the clinic in the township reduced from 6 days to 2 days, and that resulted in resentment by the city folks. And I began to understand what elite capture was all about, and their assumption that the benefits are being taken away by the poor. But it usually doesn't happen that way, because realizing the fact that there are other professionals who were there earlier also. So the challenge for us was affirmative action without disturbing the social cohesion, which is something that needed to be addressed. And that is how we came up with the solution of universalizing the services and making sure that no one gets left behind. And this was again, we used it efficiently or effectively in our subsequent participatory learning and action meetings. We also realized that addressing equity is a design issue. Like in the participatory learning and action, or the PLA model that Ekjut has pioneered and is being widely used now for communitization of health. These meetings are open to all. However, the meetings are designed in such a way that it attracts the poorest, and the team's emphasis is also on not missing out on those living in the hamlets. So when the meetings are happening, the facilitator makes sure that the poorest do attend the meetings. So that would be my, the different personal experience of the barriers that I have come across. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think you brought to life some of the issues you faced from a caste-based barrier, as well as the importance of a participatory learning approach. On that note, we move to Preeti. Preeti's worked, as we heard, extensively with sex workers, and she herself is an eminent human rights activist. So, Preeti, over to you.
Thanks, Preeta. When we talk about barriers and women in the sex trade, I feel, and my experience constantly has been that this is not a priority group for our health care service providers at all. They received and continue to receive attention only because of HIV. and to a great extent it stays even today limited to STIs and HIV control, and addressing stigma around this only. Okay. And again, in the recent time, they have received attention, and a lot of attention, also because of COVID, and I think for all the wrong reasons. One of the barriers that we've constantly experienced, women have experienced and shared with us, is about the stigma associated to the sex trade and the fear of discrimination in health services experienced by these women. And this we find is the fundamental obstacle, causes and key barriers that very often prohibit health seeking attitudes and practices among these women. Again, in our experience, we've seen that there are many multiple layers of stigma, so it's not just one layer. For example, there is social stigma, there's structural stigma, and there is self stigma as well. There is also this feeling of not being wanted by the healthcare system, and then there is also, women have also shared their experience of how healthcare service providers are very judgmental about what they do, about their life, about them being in the brothel, in the red light area, and not being accepted in society in general, and regarded as either criminals, and this is all quote unquote, immoral, troublemakers, sex deviants, vectors, people who spread these diseases. Then we also find that their perpetrators have a great role to play here. Their perpetrators also reinforce all this. It's ingrained in them that their current status of being in the sex trade is an offense and it's a crime, and therefore women refrain from accessing any public services in general, and definitely healthcare services. Then, like I said, there are the perpetrators, they are pimps, they are constantly controlling them, and they are the ones who decide when and what kind of health services, what type and quality of health services these women will access. Very often, like Nirmala also said, women are taken or permitted to access very local private healthcare providers who are often not very qualified. So I remember when we started work in 1986, we would use the word quacks. Then there is the right, there is this entire violation of right to privacy and not maintaining confidentiality at all, which also keeps these women away from the public healthcare system. Then, of course, there is so much of work that still needs to be done around the superstitions and the beliefs and the myths on treatments doing the round, which also act as the barrier. And I also feel, barriers do not occur in isolation, and that they make women less likely to re-engage with health services. Then there are also mindsets, operational and community barriers. So, just to name a few, these are some of the barriers that we have experienced, because of which, women do not access the public healthcare services. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Preeti. And you're right that the barriers itself are multifaceted and go into deep mindset, and cultural factors beyond what is experienced in the healthcare system. We can move on to Shanti, who hopefully would bring us a richer perspective from the persons of disability experience that she's had extensively.
Thanks,
Shanti.
Prita. Thank you so much. And I love the metaphors you used. It'll really help to build the story. To explain the stigma and discrimination, I just want to give a backdrop of what we do, right? And what we've experienced. We impact livelihoods across 14 disabilities. And when that happens, we have seen that same person with disability who has been forgotten in society is now a valued employee, a valued member in their own family, valued volunteer. 81% are supporting their families, 35% are primary bread earners, and earning, we have people who are deafblind earning 4 times the median per capita income, etc. So, people with multiple disabilities working. So what is it telling you? That every person has that potential. And now if we take the healthcare system, and I'll just tell you at disability onset. So imagine you or me or anybody in the audience, we just have vision impairment, some problem happens. The problem is when the person is told there is no cure. That means life is over. So when we get persons with disability coming to us, it's been 10 years, 15 years, they were in a train, they heard about the organization, and then they come to you. I mean, it's a very strange coincidence. But if those 10 years were crunched down, that's where stigma starts, isn't it? I remember when I just had my sciatica or whatever, in the next day I was working because I had all my solutions around me. So that's the first thing, that there is a knowledge gap that persons with disability are valuable to society. And then there is, so imagine if this gap is addressed by, hey, go to this rehab immediately, and things get started. The second issue is that rehab, I think, is not understood in our country and how vital it plays a role. So again, I know of people now who travel all around the country, but the gentleman was for 10 years with spinal cord injury, lying, in his village, and talks of how ants and all sorts of things would crawl around him, and he can't even make a movement for him to swat that ant. But the truth is, today he is zipping around the country in a wheelchair. So, there is no question of you not being able to get back if that rehab had been given. But see human resilience, even after 10 years, the gentleman is now doing it, right? So that's what it tells you. If I give the example of one of our colleagues, almost 50% of our colleagues are persons with disability, and different ones. So, we get of the experience. He said till 15 years, he did not know what a crutch was. So here, rehab is just getting that crutch. I mean, come on, crutch has been solved like gazillion years back, right? And and he said that his school was 15 meters away, and he'd keep looking at his school. He used to try to, walk with his hands, but dogs would come attack him, and so he didn't go to school. Now it's a different issue. Today he's working with us, and just see. That's why we say at Enable India, it's the celebration of the human spirit. I mean, despite all this, people are, coming forward, right? If I take the other, so basically a lot of the stigma or discrimination is the fact that you didn't get access on time. So you look as if you're not capable of something. That is point one. And then there is this power thing that what are you going to do in life, right? So imagine if every rehab worker could give stories saying, hey, you know what? I know 5 people who are working in this MNC and that. Suddenly, even the person doing rehab and even the parents and family. So the support system is very important that they are educated well, right? If you look at mental health, how many people do we have, psychiatrists or psychologists in the country, etc.? So then there is the problem of abundance. The scarcity is creating a major issue. So I feel the lens that people have been using is poor thing, let's give them some treatment. But the truth is, if you look at it from an economic lens, how many people can get work from disability itself, right? The paraprofessionals required, the people who are making this crutch. So I feel somewhere the lens has been used differently. And when you see the value that the disabled will give and how others will get value, perhaps hopefully things will change. The other issue that I see is because of the knowledge gap, people are forcing, let's say, a cochlear implant in somebody who's much later, has got deaf and then later they're giving cochlear implant. It's not for everybody. It is not a panacea. So, and today, if you hear the deaf voice, many of them say that the cochlear implant was not useful, hearing aid, but is somebody listening to their voice or actually not their voice, right? The other thing is, if I look at one of the acid survivors who came, I think things worked for her because she got some company sponsorship. She had 36 surgeries. That means you need the finance for it. She had a counselor. She was provided a car so that she could come and get rehabilitated with us. That's the kind of holism. And I'm not saying everything is the health system. It's more about what system will ensure something like this happens. Today, she is working in the Defense Department, and she does not tell me, she's saying it's a secret of what I do. I can't tell you what work I do. I mean, it's such a matter of pride for us. So I'll stop here, but the 2 other things I want to tell very quickly is daily health care is also a problem, because maybe a person with cerebral palsy who has a problem, shaking with their hands or not able to speak does not necessarily get treatment again because of, hey, who are you? And, there's a certain power issue that comes there. And even daily self-care. How does menstrual hygiene for a person with vision impairment work or an intellectual disabled work, right? During COVID times, we found that the knowledge gap created a problem. A person with chronic neurological symptoms can't even speak because of the problem. And if the doctor doesn't understand it, no fault of anybody, we need to see how to fix it in the system. But there is access to healthcare becomes an issue. So I'll kind of stop here. I think the insights come only from 2-3 things. In one way, it is this not knowing that the person with disability is a valuable member to society. And if we take the economic angle, these are the insights we see which will take the healthcare system forward.
Yeah, thanks, Shanti. I think that brought to life not just recognizing, but also celebrating differences. So I think that's a very, very important mindset, not just for some parts of the population, but everyone at large, to make them more visible and celebrate their differences, because everybody brings something to the table. We'll move on to Thelma. And Thelma, I'd love you to speak about Sochra's experience, given your work in public health, both equity and action side.
Yeah. Thank you, Preeta. And yeah, it's wonderful to be part of this great panel. Uh, my experience actually started when I was in St. John's as a young doctor, and we worked with the Mallur Health Cooperative, which was the first cooperative which was linked, health to a milk cooperative. And we were running the clinic there. And then when we had a group of social scientists who came and studied our work, they realized and told us that actually the people cannot access the clinic even though we're right there in the village because of the caste issue. So there was a bench outside our clinic, and those from the Dalit background were not able to come and sit on the bench. So even if their number was called, they were right outside and couldn't hear the number. That really opened my eyes to the whole issue of discrimination and, in a way, exclusion because of caste, even though we are sitting right, this was in 1970s, and I'm talking about. Now, subsequent to that, we got involved with the Bhopal disaster as response to the Bhopal disaster as part of the Medico Friends Circle in India. And that really opened my eyes to the whole issue of, in a way, corporate, irresponsibility with regard to the environment and with regard to setting up plants which are very dangerous right within the very close to a major city like Bhopal. And I happen to have grown up in Bhopal as a child, and the house where I stayed actually became the hospital for the victims of this tragedy. And that really made one pretty angry, at the way the response happened. And as we all know, the case is still going strong. Justice is not fully achieved as yet. Now, this led all of us to, in a way, move beyond the medical college and work in a collective. And as I was doing some work on tuberculosis, actually, one of my hypotheses was that though we had been in the voluntary healthcare sectors for about a couple of decades, actually, we were not a countervailing power to the structural issues that you were talking about in your in your opening comments. And as a result of this, and as a result of many other sort of people feeling similarly, in fact, the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan was formed in India. Because many of us graduated in the year 1978. I did, which was the year of the Alma Ata conference, where health for all became the slogan and comprehensive primary health care as the strategy. And health for all was to be by 2080. Now we come to 2080, there's no signs of health for all, and and that's where we realize that these determinants of health are really very deep rooted and structural, as you rightly said. So the JNC in India, as well as the Global People's Health Movement, has actually focused on many of these barriers. And I would say that we do see that even COVID has exposed the weaknesses both within the system, the health system, as well as the really deep-rooted issues that communities face across the country. We had a really bad time. And I would like to mention that rural India still has a much, much worse time than the urban India. So that's one of the big barriers. Though the National Rural Health Mission was started, and we were part of many of the task groups, setting up of the ASHA program, trying to build from our early experiences in Mallur, where we had a community health worker, and in all our 7 rural health projects, we had community health workers and health committees. And, and of course, this was a global experience. And so our NRHM setting up of ASHAs, setting up of village health and sanitation committees was a step in the right direction, and I think it's definitely helped. ASHAs have been in the backbone of the response to COVID. But when you look at the ASHAs themselves, I would say they are really remarkable women, really, all power to them. But we, as a society, have failed them, I feel, because we have not compensated them fairly. We've not provided them the social protection that they need, and even the training that they need in order to respond to such a situation. So I do see that that is a major barrier that even, I mean, the large section of women who are in the frontline workers, be they ANMs, Anganwadi workers, Anganwadi helpers, and they are really not treated fairly. They are still all seen as volunteers when actually, and then at the same time, they're seen as part of the health system, and are expected to do all sorts of things. So there are high expectations and very poor, support and remuneration. So I would say that that is a barrier. So unless we address those issues of equity that I think Nirmala and the other panelists have raised, we are not going to be able to, to actually get to reach the health for all or goal even in another 10 years. I think we need to work towards universal health care as a collective across different sectors and across different parts of the health system. So I think we made early steps, but my last point is that I think public health itself, while it has got greater recognition, and I would say with the starting up of the Public Health Foundation of India in 2006, but it's really not got enough recognition in terms of the leadership, in terms of their voice, in terms of their presence. Every district, every taluk, if it had a good public health workforce, just as they have in Thailand and various other countries, who've responded to the pandemic much more sensibly and also much more scientifically. I think public health itself is not got the recognition that it deserves, and we need to invest far more in. There are many people who graduated at MPH, but the career options are really not there for them. So I'm just giving a broad brush of all the issues.
No, that's, I think, very, very helpful. And I think you brought up the right point about how we define universalization of healthcare. And recognizing differences is a very critical part of what's considered inclusive and universal healthcare. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to make a segue here into potential solutions. I think several of us in the audience, and of course the panelists, are living through some of the issues and gaps that each one of you spoke about so eloquently. Um, how do you think India can actually make a difference in the design? As one of you said, it's a design issue. I think, Nirmala, you brought that out. How do we change the design and execution of the health systems to be more inclusive, more empowering of these populations? And secondly, how do you ensure the voices and engagement of these communities? Because it's one thing to have a top down dictated approach to healthcare, and it's a second, a very different approach to turn it on its head and ensure that what the communities desire is actually given to them in a dignified and in a way that is accepting of them and not divisive of their needs, interests, and backgrounds. So, on that note, I think this is the second major question, and I'd love to do a round robin again of each of you to talk about what you see as the possible solutions, both, as I said, to recognize these communities and capture their voice more meaningfully, and to design and implement a better healthcare system for all. So maybe we'll shift the order a little bit here, and I'd like to leave maybe the final at least 5-6 minutes for audience questions, 2 or 3 of which have already come up. So if each of you could maybe keep to about 3 minutes for your remarks. Preeti, could you go first on this one? I think you're on mute, Preeti.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
The group that I work with, women in the sex trade, I feel first and foremost it's extremely important for us to see them beyond HIV, AIDS, and STI control management. We need to, when we talk about changing things for them and we talk about their involvement, I think we need to understand that their healthcare needs go beyond HIV and STIs. The other is, I think, as healthcare seekers, we need to engage them not just in understanding their needs, but engage them in planning, engage them in finding solutions, which today again, like I said, is so limited to HIV and STI control. The other is, I often feel that we talk, we have policies, we have things on paper, we come out with new services, but we don't make matching budgetary provisions. If they are, then they're so nominal, and that does not work for the marginalized communities at all. The other, I think, way forward is, how do we ensure that the training that we provide to healthcare providers is more empathetic, is more, we call it in social work, client centric. So maybe in the medical space, we would call it patient centric. That it would be non-judgmental, that there needs to be a very, very trauma informed intervention. And this is something I find lacking. And again, I'm talking more about the group that we talk to, because we work with, because they experience so much of trauma. And when they go to the healthcare services, uh, with the trauma that they're going, it adds up, because the entire hostile experience that they encounter at the healthcare service itself puts them, I mean, like, sort of uh, I mean, they do not want to want to access any of these services. So I think somewhere
Sure.
that needs to be worked on. Outreach, I often find there is very little being done around our outreach. We spoke about ASHA workers. There's so much of stigma around sex trade that ASHA workers do not want to do outreach, because of the fear that they would get associated with the sex trade in some way. So how
Yeah.
do we handle these issues? Also, having more of, involving these women, and having more of arogya samitis at the local level, which, we can train them, we can support them, involve them in planning, action, monitoring local health services. I think, to begin with,
Thanks.
these are some of the and of course, last, I think healthcare services have to be made, I call them available, accessible, acceptable, and good
Mm.
quality. If they're not going to be of good quality, our group will turn to private healthcare service providers. And the more they move towards private healthcare service providers, the more indebted they become, and the more control the perpetrators of the sex trade have on them. Because the every time they spend on their health at the private healthcare service provider, that is considered as a loan by the perpetrators, and this loan just gets accumulated, gets mounted, and increasing the control of the perpetrators on these women. So I think these
Sure.
are some of the issues that need to be addressed.
Thanks, Preeti. I think that emphasized a lot of the different facets that need change, and particularly resourcing, because unless you resource adequately, like you said, it's impossible to change a lot of these practices, both on the demand and supply side. Could we move on to Nirmala? What are maybe the top 2 to 3, changes that you would like to see for the healthcare system to be more responsive and inclusive?
I think I spoke about equity being a design issue. Just to go back to that a little bit, when we did our first trial, we had defined marginalized as those belonging to the tribal and scheduled caste communities. They had minimum assets and with minimal or no schooling. And we found through our sub-analysis that 70%, 71% reduction had happened in the newborn mortality rates. And this was again, when it was repeated by the ASHAs as the facilitators, we found another 61% reduction in newborn mortality rate. And these results were widely shared among the decision makers, and that led to one of the largest community mobilization effort, where currently more than 40,000 ASHAs of Jharkhand are conducting these meetings regularly, and this has been evaluated with more than 50,000 births, and we have some promising results. And the results are more are more seen in the among the poorest quintiles. And this is currently being peer reviewed, so I can't share the results right now. But this is one of our findings. So, if we are able to do or be convinced that marginalized people can be reached, that is one way to go about it. And we have our own assumptions. For example, when we looked at this particular study that I'm talking about, there are we believe that tribal populations are monolithic, but actually there are 32 different identified tribal groups within Jharkhand, and some of them, or 8 of them, actually belong to the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. So our assumption was that they are all monolithic and one size fit all solutions could be done. But it doesn't happen that way, because for this particular intervention, we had to look at an intervention, a specifically designed module for the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Looking at their visual literacy levels, it was entirely a pictorial module, and an additional manpower was to assist the ASHA as a co-facilitator for these meetings, who also understood the local dialect, which also meant that additional budgetary allocations was to be made by the government. So how we are able to influence the government to make these changes is something I just wanted to point out. The other one other thing that mm, I think the health and wellness center is an excellent idea and probably needs more investment. So if we are able to provide the doctor with enough preventive, curative, and palliative, and with skills on community engagement for all age groups, that could be a good starting point, I think. And one other thing, like Dr. Thelma was saying, GSS had tried, support group meetings for sickle cell anemia, for mental health, and all other NCDs also. If these support groups could be also part of the health and wellness centers, and they could reach out to the most marginalized communities through a group of, say, volunteers, not volunteers, I would say, an additional staff who could reach out to more than 2 or 3 villages and reach out to these particularly vulnerable groups. That would be good. And lastly, I would just like to say, we have tried with some rural creches also for children. These creches are more nearer to their homes, where children are provided with a very safe environment and safe drinking water, food supplements, smoke-free environment, and early childhood stimulation activities. And these are actually working out to be really beneficial for the children under 3 years of age. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Nirmala. And we're really looking forward to the paper that you mentioned. So hopefully when it's public, we will all benefit from it. Moving on to Thelma, and in the interest of time, I'm also going to weave in one of the questions from the audience for you about how community workers can be equipped better to address these differences when they work with these communities. Thelma, I mean, given you've got extensive experience at, in public health in communities, could you also maybe pick up this question as you talk about solutions and community voice? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think that's a really important question, and we've often thought of using a community health approach to a public health problem or to even a public health system. So, in a way, it's building from the base upwards, and that quality of training that goes in and the support to community health workers is crucial. Though there are ASHA support systems by different state governments working at different levels, it's been found, all over that wherever NGOs and linked to those training programs, the quality of training and then the support to the ASHAs or the community health worker, whatever name, Saya, Mitanen, or is always very much better. So I think the amount of support needed for the ASHA is and for the community-based health worker is very important to factor into the design. I think, as Nirmala rightly says, it is a design issue, and we need to factor in financial resources as well as in a way, it's not difficult to map out where are the NGOs and where are the, the most needy groups in today's world, where there is all these GIS systems and digital thing is moving forward by leaps and bounds. I think we need to do this and do this with a sense of urgency. That within about a decade or so, we definitely, because we are like 75 years down the line, we are not new to all of this, so we are quite mature in our understanding, and there's a huge pool of traders in the country. So if we see that we are all a community of learners, a community of trainers, we can actually go forward. And we also run a community health learning program in Sochara, and we are amazed by the level of enthusiasm that young people in India today have. They come from very technically trained backgrounds, but they're all really putting in their life. They're very, very keen and committed to work. So they need to have the support. So I think there are umpteen groups in the country who can provide the resources. I mean, this can't be done on love and fresh air. Here are people willing to lay down their lives, but then there's a need again for a design, for a, in a way, a career pathway, if you want to use that word, because to provide the support to the frontline workers, you need to have highly skilled, highly empathetic, highly development oriented young people, or people of whatever age group, who would be there in the long term. This is not something that's going to go away in a very short term. So I would the other thing I would say, that we really need to have intersectoral collaboration, or to work on the determinants of health. So our team works on water and sanitation quite extensively in urban as well as rural areas, as well as on nutrition in small pockets. But that is also very intense work, and it is time consuming, resource consuming in terms of finances, etc. And it needs to be done in the long term. And I would say with COVID, we've really received a big sort of setback, I would say, in that sense. So we need to redouble our efforts in working on nutrition, on food and nutrition, on livelihoods, as well as on water and sanitation, and on improving the school infrastructure, as well as Nirma was saying, of the very young child, the under 3-year-old child, who needs a lot of early childhood development. So the Anganwadis really need to be made into much more welcoming and better resourced places. And you don't need to have them only with volunteers. Anganwadi workers need to be paid much better. They need better training. There are large numbers there. So I do feel that it is possible. We have the talent, we have the resources, and but we need to have the will and the political will. We are putting in, we don't lack resources of any type in India today. And if we don't go ahead, then we have only ourselves to blame. We can't blame it on colonialism, on globalization, and on the usual, we have to be the change makers. We have to have the solidarity from below, the globalization of solidarity from below across. Now, last point is that we have about 30,000 primary health centers in the country, and about 145,000 these health centers, which are becoming health and wellness centers, as was pointed out earlier. Now, if we can say that we commit that all these 145 health and wellness centers and the 30,000 primary health centers will be upgraded, not in 10 years, in 1 year or 2 years, then you'll see the transformation that will happen across the board. And the point that Preeti has said very articulately, that it needs to be trauma. So that requires a lot of training and sensitization, because our mainstream education doesn't prepare us for any of this. LGBTQ, I saw that question earlier. We are not trained for this. I just asked a recent medical graduate who was an intern, and they didn't have a clue about it, as much as I didn't know anything about it either when we studied. So I think we have to look at our training courses and our faculty members also a little more dialogue with people like Preeti and and Shanti, etc.
Yeah. Thanks, Emma. I'm actually going to probe you a little more, if that's okay, just given your expertise. And I
Sure.
loved your term of, whether you call it globalization or universalization of solidarity from below, as you said, to quote you. But how do you really enable this? I mean, if I place this in conjunction with the point that, Nirmala just made, that there were 32 different tribal groups or identities just in Jharkhand, right? And if you look at the entire central belt, and this is just tribals, and there are multiple identities of differences, and there are persons who are also along multiple identities. So you could have, a vulnerable woman who's elderly, who's from the lower caste, and potentially also a person of disability. And that just makes it so much more complex. So when we're talking of the complexity of this, I would love to hear your thoughts about how do you ensure this solidarity from below? Because whether it's communitization or a building of, solidarity, it needs to come from within. And how do you engage them to prioritize healthcare and demand better healthcare services?
Yeah, I mean, I personally feel that there have been initiatives of having persons from the different Adivasi groups who were trained as ANMs. You know, there was a special tribal ANM training. There are some special schools in some pockets. It's not union, not across the country, and they were then wanted to work in their own areas, and their cultural connect with their own people was much higher than any other. You know, so I think when persons with disability, persons who've been in trafficked, are also given opportunity to join the workforce, the health workforce. You know that they will make much better health workers, and they will have all the experience to share. Now, talking of accountability, there is this whole initiative called Community Action for Health, which has a strong basis on accountability, you know, using the traffic signal approach. And we have found that where CH was used, those centers, those PHCs actually began to perform much better in a matter of 1 or 2 years, because there was feedback loops to the health workers. There was a more dynamic relationship with the communities in that region. So yes, these are all design issues, but they should not remain as small innovations. They have to be scaled up. And there are sufficient, let me tell you, from 15 years experience with the NRHM, there are many people who actually oppose this. They don't want to have community monitoring. They don't want to have social accountability because it does upset a few apple carts, you know, and it raises questions, makes life a little bit. But in the long run, it's for everybody's good. In fact, with equity, it's good for everybody. It's a social good. Even the elite would benefit from greater equity, you know. So, but if you look at our budgets, our health budgets are astonishingly low. Look at where we are on the Human Development Index. We've been stuck at 130, 31 for years on end, you know. And why can't we go higher? Because we are not budgeting, we are not prioritizing health. And I don't see we have gone great trying to, you know, advocate for greater budgets, advocate for greater resources. I have to say we failed on that, you know. And I think we will not achieve full freedom in this country unless everybody has access to healthcare and to health. We have to have better health and access to healthcare, and we can do it. I mean, I'm absolutely sure about that. There are enough of field community experiences which have shown that women who may have done fourth standard, fifth standard do remarkably well and can reduce anemia, which is very difficult to reduce in a
That's true.
community setting, but it's been done.
Yes. Thanks so much, Thelma. Moving on, to Shanti, and there's a audience question from you that many have raised about your point about making more visible the disabilities. And the question is really about how do you enable the ecosystem first to understand invisible disabilities, such as hemophilia, so that they understand the challenges and how to solve for it. Because as all of the speakers before you have mentioned, there is no current empathy and even training to understand these disabilities. So that's the first step. So would love to hear from you about the solutions, but focusing on this part.
We have been a firm believer of making persons with disability in the center of this, and where they catalyze and co-create a world for themselves. So, we have been looking at tools like thin infrastructure that enables them, and that's worked really well. So while we talk of the system, there's a role that the person also can play. So we have 2-3 examples where, in our rural social networking platform, which is an IVR-based thing, when COVID came and, there's such less information, especially for persons with disability. People took matters in their own hands and they started supporting each other, which is not to let the government off or the system off, but here's where persons with disability are voicing what is required for them, and that is a very important voice, because somewhere being marginalized doesn't mean the person is powerless or doesn't have the capability to speak for themselves. So that's something I want to lay on the table. And in fact, we have this wonderful thing called Project Discovery, which asks persons with disability. It worked across 25 states last year. And in 3 months, we asked them, hey, give us solutions you're using on a daily basis. You should see the kind of health solutions a spinal cord injured person is saying, hey, this is what I do. And those are real solutions, right? So in fact, that is why I think Mr. Harshal has asked about this hemophilia thing, right? I would want the person, first, what are the best practices they're using? And let's inform the system that this is what is working and this is how, we can work together, right? So that is point number one. Point number two is I think it's time, there may be one person who is good about blood disorders. Let's imagine. I want the community to point out, hey, here's an ally and how we can harness our allies. Right now, it looks like rainwater is not getting harvested. It's okay. That's what we call includability. Inclusion doesn't come easily to everybody. So if there is a competency, everybody should be focusing their attention and saying, this is the peer who's going to help others, right? So it's the behavioral science of appreciative inquiry, right? Can we focus on where it's growing and let's harness that power? Similarly, best practices. I think we're talking about inclusion. So inclusion is not about disability as much as in the village. How do I screen for finding a person who is deaf? And you have such wonderful examples. Mr. Rangasai is there. He says, hey, you take a matchstick and that would be X decibel. So we are not talking about the equipment costs crores. And yes, we don't have the equipment, but that cannot be an excuse. Go for this gentleman's solution, right? So there are enough solutions there which are low cost. There's this wonderful gentleman, Dr. Vinikar, who has this ROP thing solved, pat, but we're not actually harnessing that. So we need to stop everything, just look around, understand the best practices and just expand it. And I think when we talk of lived experiences, we should not forget the ASHA workers or the ANMs or even the overburdened government doctor. What are your issues? What is stopping you? So I think before we demand empathy from them, I say we will be empathetic to them and then maybe we'll get a response. I also want to put tools in the hand of a person with disability. I mean, this we didn't try, but there was a very quirky thing we wanted to try, okay? Maybe you're in bed and you're deaf, blind, or this happened to a Down's kid who was having COVID, can't even speak for him or herself. And I felt, why can't I have a board which says, this gentleman was working in Lemon Tree. So, here is it, right? I am XYZ, Down syndrome. I can't speak for myself. Call my mother. This is the number. So then this is a tool for empathy. And with that tool, suddenly the doctor can also look more empathetic. So I think we need to try maybe this is a very strange experiment, but why can't we try this, right? I think the last thing I want to say is our system can look better if we unify the data. If we can actually, so for hemophilia, right? If we know there are 100 people in this area with hemophilia, these are the hospitals where, blood is required, supplements are required. This is where a sickle cell person is there or whatever, right? I think, today with technology, if we can't do this much, what are we doing, right? And I think India is very well positioned because we've got that whole Aadhaar multi-level, multi-tenanted thing. We can add things very easily on top of this. So I think the time is now and we can do it. I'm very positive that, and we are actually working on a societal mission to do something like this. Let's see where it goes. And I'm sure everybody here in the audience also will be a stakeholder in this, especially the panelists. Thank you so much, Preeta.
Thanks for that. One question again from the audience is about how do you ensure accountability? And I think some of you already touched upon it, but how do you really strengthen accountability when these differences are across strata, across dimensions? And I'll leave any one of you to volunteer to pick this up. Anyone who wants to talk through this point on accountability?
Well, maybe I could have a little go. I think it's an extremely important issue, and also in the context of COVID, but even without COVID, I think accountability, particularly of the health system, is very important because it deals with life and death. So it's something at every level, including at the level of tertiary care, secondary care, the larger institutions, and of as well as at the grassroots level of PHCs and their services. But I would actually, the lens has so far been too much on the frontline workers in trying to get the PHC medical officer and the staff. And I really think that that's not the place where accountability should go, because they really have very limited decision and making power, and they have very limited resources. So therefore, sometimes I worked in a PHC myself. And so therefore, blaming them for certain lack of services is really not the most appropriate thing to do. It's at the higher levels where we have to look at, so where we ask for accountability is, I think, important for all of us as a system to think about, and both of the public health system as well as of the private sector. There has to be accountability on all sides. We've seen the really absence of oxygen, various other issues that you don't want to bring up here, but I think it does show the dire need and the dire consequences of not having account. There are many. The Community Action for Health has a lot of manuals. The Population Foundation of India is the secretariat for the AGC, of which I'm a member, and there are a lot of training manuals for community-based workers on ensuring accountability at different levels, from PHC, CHC, district hospital, etc. And many of them are on the website and they're available in different languages. This is on the NHM website, if you go to CH. But there's also others like the Accountability Initiative of the Center for Policy Research, which has been doing some interesting studies of late. And I would really suggest that people read those. They have a story to tell. So I think research plays a role also in accountability.
Thanks, Thelma, and I can't agree more, because there's importance of the holistic system, private, public, data and knowledge, and how research underlies all of this to come up with the right mechanisms. I'd love to go back to Preeti, and Preeti, I know you've done a lot of work on rights and dignity, in amongst the populations you work on. So I would love to bring back the focus on the dignity approach, and hear from you about your experience there in solving for this issue.
Yeah, thanks. I think when we're talking about health and women in the sex trade, and when it comes to this whole issue of dignity, I one, like I had earlier said, engaging these women in understanding their rights. So for us, it's extremely important that the communities we work with, talk about them understanding their rights. We also talk about giving them skills. So very often what we find is let's take health, okay. If we have groups, we have peer groups, we are only talking and giving them information and equipping them around information on health issues, but we need to go beyond that. I think somewhere we need to also give them soft skills to negotiate, skills to put their point forward, also skills around leadership besides other skills. And I think when we speak about dignity of these of such community, one of the things we constantly and keep doing is how do we ensure their right to information, access to information, and how also train them on how to use this information, and who are the people that they should reach out to. The other is, I think, we were talking about data. So very often we are talking about numbers, and we are bringing out data around issues that have not happened. I call it sometimes negative data. We're not sharing about positive things. We are not sharing experiences and things that happen in the community where women have, like you were saying, very many of us fight from a position of privilege. Women that we work with do not fight from a position of privilege. They have to, they face so many odds, and their fights are from that from that situation where there are odds, there is no privilege. And I think when they still come out successful, when they still achieve something, when they still come out fighting not for themselves but for their children and other women, I think this is the data we need to put out there. And this is how I feel the our journey, our entire journey of restoring dignity is how we've tried to achieve for these women.
Yeah, thanks, Preeti. I think that's very well said. And in fact, when we hear of this common quote that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and we in the privileged world think of it when we have some adverse life incidents. And, traveling across tribal districts, I'm struck how these people live through that experience probably on a day-to-day basis. And what breaks us and what quote unquote breaks them, there's such a large difference that, we wouldn't know it until we live it. So, I think your points are very, very well taken. I'll go back to Nirmala, given her rich experience, and she started her conversation with talking about the participatory learning and action, which is now very much socialized, not just in India but also globally. So Nirmala, maybe in 2 minutes, and I know that would not do enough justice to the whole approach, but I'd like to challenge you a little here to say, if you had a wand and you were going to change the way decision making was done to include these communities, make healthcare systems more participatory, both in learning and in the way the practices are, what would you actually change? Because what we often don't address is the root cause. We address the symptoms, and to me PLA really goes to addressing some of the root causes and changing the way decisions could be made. So I'd love to hear your experience about how do you ensure those methods can change the way the system is empathetic in making decisions and delivering them to communities.
Thank you, Preeta, once again. Uh, I spoke about the large scale up that is happening across Jharkhand now. It's also happening in almost half of Madhya Pradesh and parts of Rajasthan, Uttarakhand as well. So when the meetings are happening, we make sure that the the community invites decision makers to these meetings. So we've had Principal Secretary Health from Delhi coming in and attending one of these meetings, and many doctors have been invited to attend the meetings. And these are one forum where the community is able to connect with the decision makers, and that actually has had you can say this has actually happened because of our prior engagement with the community with the people at the decision or the policy levels. And I think also because many of these uh, I suggested about these the treatment gaps, for example, in the mental health area. So in Jharkhand, the prevalence rate is about 11% of mental illness, and along with stigma and discrimination, people are exposed to restricted participation, which branding is a major issue here. And people with psychosocial disabilities are, I'm sure all of you agree, is a multiply marginalized group. So here we have now conceptualized a collaboration with the Central Institute of Psychiatry in Ranchi to provide tele-psychiatry services through trained lay counselors who will play a major role in providing counseling at their doorsteps. And along with that, support group meetings for the service users as well as the caregivers. And these meetings are has been named as Sukhu Dukhu meetings or Baitakis, and this name has been coined by them, by the groups. And over the last more than a year, we've noticed that drug adherence has actually is almost 90% among them. So collaborating with key personnel in the government system, it goes a long way in getting things done. And and we also have seen that affirmative action is one thing I think we need to talk about more and more. In my district, which is almost 67% tribal population, we've come across many doctors and health staff who are very empathetic, very dignified, very respectful to the people who come to them. So I think affirmative action is one way of looking at this whole uh, concept. And we, for the last few years, we've been also working with adolescent. I think we should not be forgetting the adolescents, that group, age group. We have been trained, we trained these Yuva Sathis, and during the pandemic, they were actually the ones who were taking up the main work in the community. They were engaged in relief work, helping students with online classes, distribution of medicines to the people with mental illness, helping mobilize communities for vaccination. Earlier, there was a very low response rate from the community, but now with their help, I think we getting a very good response from the community.
Thank
They are
you
also
so much.
involved in writing up posters, etc. For another group of people that we have looked at are the Adhikar Sathis, which is only in one district in Jharkhand. The Adhikar Sathis are a link between the community, particularly vulnerable tribal groups, and their food entitlements and other entitlements. So the food is delivered at their doorsteps. So these are some things that just come to my mind, and I think
That's very helpful.
yeah, and just lastly,
Thanks
I think we were talking about the education system. I think Telma spoke about it. I just like to quote one. This morning, I just read Dr. Kalantri's quote, and what he says is, "I wonder if the medical textbooks should have had two versions: one for the perfect world, and the other for the poor and the unjust world. No textbook teaches us how to practice medicine in resource poor settings that lacks tests, drugs, doctors, and money." I think it's a very good quote, Dr. Kalantri. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think I could listen forever to this panel, but unfortunately, we are 1 minute over time, and it's been a very, very enriching discussion. And I'd love to draw on what Abhishek, one of our audience members, have said. So, this is a request to Piramal Swasthya, who's the kind host of this session. If there's any way we could bring together the kind of practices, methods, tools that were put forth in this session, I think we've had very rich and practical experiences and solutions that were shared by every panelist. I think that would really help continue this conversation overall. I'll end this with just thanking all the panelists, but also one final thought for everyone attending this session. Many of us would have heard of the curb cut effect, which is about designing features that support certain persons of disability. And for example, a ramp that can help mobility, challenged persons. And those initiatives actually help a much wider range of population, right? So women with prams can go up that ramp easier. The elderly can go up with ramps, easier. So can each of us think of some curb cut effects in our daily lives and think innovatively about how we are helping others in a more inclusive way? So I'd like to leave all of us with that thought going forward. And thank you so much to everyone. And it's been great to participate in this discussion, which has been very solution oriented. Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Preeta.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks to
Tafti.
all the
Thanks,
participants.
everyone.
Thank you.
I would like to thank the panelist, the moderator, and also the audience, and request to pull up the poll question. So, for the audience, we would like to get a feedback for the session. We are just putting up the poll question. If you can respond to that, that will be great. Extremely enriching discussion. I think each one, what we heard actually touched our heart. So close, and it makes us thinking on lot of things we are ignorant about or we have not taken cognizance of. So thanks for bringing those, and this platform, the Chacha platform, is to a platform to deliberate these issues, to even nudge people to think how even in a small act in a daily life we can make a difference. Thanks to all of you. The next session will start at 6 o'clock. So request all of you, 6:05. So we would have you again on the health track, meet you again. This is about Mind the Mind. It's more about mental health. So look forward to have you again. May I request